Do you believe a wild creature could ever sing? Now, imagine that song isn't a growl or a howl, but a lullaby. The exact lullaby a grieving mother once sang to her missing daughter. For over 30 years, Margaret White, a retired schoolteacher, was mocked by her entire town. They said she was mad, wandering through the Olympic woods each winter, clutching a worn teddy bear, singing. But what they didn't know was that something in the forest had been listening. And on the 31st year, it finally answered, not with a sound of rage, but with a voice so low, so mournful. It echoed the very lullaby Margaret once sang. This isn't any police report. There's no footage, no viral post, only a faded diary and a teddy bear stitched back together with purple thread. Today, you'll hear the story the town tried to forget, and the voice that made them remember. After this, you may never hear, "You are my sunshine," the same way again. And the next time you walk near the woods, you might wonder if something out there is singing with you. I found the journal tucked inside a cedar chest that smelled of dust and pine sap, nestled beside a small, battered teddy bear with one missing eye. It seems patched with violet thread. The name inked on the first yellowed page was Margaret White. She was 73 when she died, a former elementary school teacher. Lived alone for decades in a cabin skirting the Olympic National Forest. They buried her in the cold gray hush of December, not far from where the trees crowd so close the light forgets how to fall. But that's not why people remembered her. They remembered the woman who wandered the woods singing to no one. The one children whispered about on dares. The forest ghost. Some called her the crazy lady with the lullaby. Her name was always spoken with a kind of uneasy awe. The journal told the story none of them ever really asked to know. Margaret had a daughter once, Lily, 5 years old. Vanished on a camping trip 30 years ago. One moment chasing a squirrel through the underbrush. The next, nothing. No screams, no tracks. Just the forest closing in behind her like it never opened. Margaret never believed she was dead. Not really. No body, no blood, just silence. In her journal she wrote, "They say I'm mad, but if losing your child doesn't drive you mad, then maybe you never loved her at all." And as I read that line, I paused. Something about it held a weight no reason could lift. The page beneath my fingers felt soft, worn by years of touch and tears. Some words were smeared into water stains. The kind that don't come from the rain. She had kept a cassette, too. I played it. The tape hissed, cracked, and then her voice, gentle, cracked at the edges. "You are my sunshine. My only sunshine." It wasn't sung to be heard. It was sung to be remembered. Not by Lily, Margaret knew too well that was unlikely, but by the forest itself. Because what do you do when the world stops listening? You sing anyway. She believed the trees were listening. That somehow, between bark and root, memory lingered. She waited in that belief longer than most would call sane. But then again, most people haven't had everything taken in one breath of fog. What unsettled me most, though, was what came after that tape ended. There was another voice. Softer, deeper, slower. As if the song had echoed, and something had echoed it back. That was the last thing on the cassette, and that's when I knew I couldn't stop reading. It was a Thursday. Margaret remembered because the morning had started ordinary. Pancakes shaped like hearts. Lily's tiny voice trying to recite the alphabet backward just to make her mother laugh. The woods behind their campsite were shrouded in that thick Olympic mist, the kind that never quite lifts, like the forest was holding its breath. Margaret had turned away for less than a minute. She'd been folding their damp clothes over a line strung between two trees. She remembered humming. She remembered Lily humming back, then silence. Not the kind that follows sleep, but the kind that follows something taken. When she turned around, the small yellow hoodie was gone. No footsteps, no broken twigs, no callback when Margaret shouted her name. Only that unnatural quiet, as if even the birds had looked away. She ran, tore through the trees screaming, her voice clawing at the sky. It was the kind of scream that didn't echo, because the trees swallowed it. The rangers came. So did the dogs, the helicopters, the local volunteers. Days of searching, hundreds of boots on the ground. Not one trace. The theory they settled on was nature. Maybe a mountain lion, maybe a fall. But Margaret knew that woods. She knew how sound carried. And she knew Lily never wandered far. Still, the officials gave her what they called closure. A box of Lily's things. Her backpack, a pair of socks, and the soft little bear she always took to bed. It's possible, they said, that she got turned around, wandered deep, maybe found a ravine. These woods can be unforgiving. But none of it explained the missing sound. There was no scream, no whimper, no rustle of panic, just vanishing. What the reports never included was what Margaret saw that night. Hours after the last search crew had packed up, and the forest dimmed into an eerie glowing gray, she returned to their empty tent and found the bear repositioned. It sat upright this time, legs crossed, its threadbare arms wrapped tight around its belly. Margaret swore it hadn't been like that. She hadn't touched it. She stared at it for a long time, then tucked it into her coat and walked into the dark. The next morning, she told the sheriff. He asked her gently not to talk like that again. Years later, she would write, "I didn't lose her. She was taken. But not by an animal, not by a man. Something older, something quieter than grief." She never camped again, but she never stopped going back. And each time, the trees seemed just a little different, like they were watching, like they remembered something, but refused to say. The first time Margaret returned to the woods alone, it wasn't with a search party. There were no maps or dogs or hopeful neighbors this time, just her. A backpack that felt heavier than her grief, and a stuffed bear clutched tight enough to crease the fabric. She came back not to find Lily, but to prove to herself that something still remembered her daughter had been there. The trail was the same, but nothing else was. The forest had grown thicker, darker somehow, as if it resented her presence now. Every step cracked with old leaves and broken twigs. Sounds that used to mean Lily was skipping nearby. Now accusations. The air was cold that morning, colder than it should have been for June. And when the sun tried to cut through the canopy, the light scattered like it didn't know where to land. She stood by the same moss-covered stone where Lily had once balanced her juice box like a treasure. She placed the bear there gently, and without thinking, without knowing why, she began to hum, "You are my sunshine." It was barely a whisper at first, like something afraid to be heard. But her voice found footing in the silence. It lifted through the needles and branches like smoke, trembling, unsure. "My only sunshine." Something stirred. Not in the trees, but in her. Her chest ached. Her throat tightened. The melody was too soft to be a cry for help, but too real to be meaningless. "If you ever leave me," the wind carried it, not far, not high, but enough. And then she stopped. Suddenly, as if the song itself had revealed too much. The silence that followed wasn't the same one from 30 years ago. This one felt like listening. That was the moment, she would write later, when she first imagined the forest breathing. Not in a way leaves shiver or branches bow, but with memory. Like every tree had absorbed a piece of Lily's name. She came back the next week, and the one after that. Every time, she sang. And every time, she left the bear in a new place. She told herself it was for Lily, but deep down a part of her wondered if someone else was listening too. Then came the morning she returned to find the bear gone. No paw prints, no claw marks, just an empty patch of moss where it had been. And something else in its place. A ring of stones, and a single violet feather tucked beneath one. That was the day Margaret stopped singing for Lily alone, and started listening for an answer. At first, they brought casseroles, kind words, paper cards with forgettable prayers, the kind of comfort that expires quickly. After 6 months, they stopped calling. A year in, people crossed the street when they saw her coming. By the second year, her neighbors said her name like it might stain their lips. Margaret White had become an echo, too familiar to forget, too uncomfortable to hold on to. She lost her job. The school said it was for the best, that children needed stable teachers. Some of them still whispered, "Lily" in class, thinking it might bring her back. The principal asked her not to keep the photo of her daughter on her desk anymore. "It unsettles the others," he said. Margaret nodded. Then packed her things and never returned. She sold the house soon after, bought a plot of land on the edge of the forest, where the town's streetlights gave up and the trees began. There, she built a small cabin with her hands and memories. The townspeople said she had gone mad, that she talked to herself, that she talked to trees, but they were wrong. She never talked to herself. She talked to Lily every day. She would walk into the forest and speak aloud, describing her breakfast, her dreams, the shifting colors of the sky. Not because she thought Lily was hiding nearby, but because she didn't know how to stop being her mother, and the trees, she believed, would carry her words, would remember them the way they remembered rain. In one entry, she wrote, "I talk to the pine by the ridge like he's an old friend. He leans closer every time. If I'm crazy, I wish I'd gone crazier sooner. There's more kindness in bark than most human mouths." By year 10, no one in town spoke to her unless they had to. But still, she came to every town hall meeting, sat in the back, listened. When she spoke, it was only to ask, "Has anyone heard singing in the woods?" They never had. But some of them started locking their doors at night, as if grief was contagious. There was one boy, David, now grown, who remembered once biking too close to the tree line and seeing her standing there in the dusk. She was holding a teddy bear, whispering to it like it might answer. His mother told him not to stare. "She's still waiting," she said. "Poor thing doesn't know she's already dead inside." But Margaret knew what she was. She wasn't dead. She was listening, and the trees, they were starting to listen back. The first 10 years offered nothing. No new signs, no footprints in the moss, no whispers behind the trees. Only cold seasons rolling in. Snow frosting the windows of Margaret's cabin, wind pushing branches against the roof like fingers reminding her she was alone. But she walked. Every morning, every dusk, the bear went with her. Sometimes in her pack, sometimes cradled to her chest. She sang less now, not because she had stopped believing, but because the silence had grown so thick it swallowed her voice, like a stone dropped into a lake. Yet Margaret kept a log. She called it a field journal, as though her mourning could be measured like rainfall. She tracked temperature, moon phases, strange animal tracks she couldn't place. Once she found a deep gouge in the bark of an alder tree, 3 claws wide, 8 inches long. "Not elk," she wrote. "Too high for cougar. Too clean to be rot." No one she asked had seen anything like. Twice she slipped on wet stones and bruised her ribs. Once, she nearly froze when an unexpected snowstorm buried the trail. But she always made it home, somehow. And each time, just before losing consciousness or wandering too far off the path, something would pull her back, an unseen tug at the edge of instinct. She started to wonder if she was being followed. Not by a person, but by something that wanted her to keep going. Years passed. Her hair grayed. Her knees stiffened. The townsfolk whispered about the old forest woman and warned their kids not to wander too far. A few called animal control when they heard her singing, but Margaret kept on, immune to shame. Her only fear was forgetting Lily's voice, so she recited it aloud, line by line, until her memory hardened like stone. Then came the 9th winter. One night, as she sat by the fire, she heard what sounded like footsteps crunching in the snow just outside the window. Slow, deliberate, too heavy to be dear. She stepped out with a flashlight. Nothing. But the next morning, beside her firewood pile, were 3 smooth stones arranged in a perfect triangle. That's when she started dreaming again. Dreams of tall shapes moving between trees, of eyes that glowed not with menace, but with memory. She began to feel watched, not hunted, witnessed, like someone had been listening all these years. She wrote, "Maybe the forest has lungs. Maybe it breathes differently now." Still, nothing spoke, not yet. But the air around her had changed. There was weight to it, like the moment before the first word is said, or the pause right before a lullaby is returned. The 31st year came in quieter than the rest. No storms, no injuries, no frost-slick rocks under her boots. The snow had melted early that season, as if the forest had decided, for once, to ease its grip. Margaret marked the anniversary the same way she always had. She hiked to the stone clearing just beyond the second ridge. Same path, same worn boots, same bear in her arms, stitched and restitched until its fabric looked more scar than plush. She placed it beneath the leaning cedar, the one she always thought looked like it bowed in mourning. Then she stood back, sang the lullaby one last time in a voice that barely climbed above a whisper. No echo, no wind. Just breath turning white in the early dusk. And then she left. The next morning, when she returned to collect the bear, it was gone. At first, she thought maybe a coyote had taken it. But there were no drag marks, no torn fabric, no paw prints in the soft earth, just a patch of moss left perfectly undisturbed, as if nothing had ever touched it at all. Except something had, because in its place lay a heart made of wildflowers, petals still fresh despite the cool air. A folded cloth, yellowed with age, embroidered with a single name, Lily, in thread that had nearly faded to nothing, and a ring of stones, small and pale, and deliberately placed, surrounding it all like a shield. Beside them, nestled carefully in the grass, was a bundle of bird feathers bound together with what looked like human hair. Margaret didn't move for a long time. Her hands trembled, her knees gave slightly, and she knelt in the dirt like someone at a grave who just found out it wasn't empty. None of it made sense, but none of it felt wrong. "If this is a prank," she wrote that night, "then someone out there knows my story better than I do, and they understand pain in a way that doesn't laugh." She didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside seemed more alive, more intentional. Nothing approached. Nothing knocked. The forest just waited. Then, somewhere around 3 a.m, when the fire had dimmed to a flicker and her mind drifted toward half-sleep, she heard it. A lullaby, not hers, but hers. The same melody, slower, lower, like it had traveled a great distance through something that did not sing often. She sat up, every hair on her body standing, heart pounding against her ribs like it wanted to run. But she didn't run. She listened, and for the first time in 3 decades, something finally sang back. It was the kind of night Margaret had always feared. The kind where the wind didn't howl, where no branches snapped, where everything held still like the forest was waiting for something to happen. She'd left the fire low on purpose. Somehow, too much light felt invasive now, like it might scare off whatever had left the stones, or provoke it. She'd brought the bear again. Not the original. It was still missing, but a near-identical one, stitched by hand from old cloth. She placed it on the same mossy stone, right beneath the arching cedar, and she waited. The air was thicker than usual, like it hadn't decided whether to rain or freeze. Hours passed. No movement. Not even a raccoon. Not even a moth drawn to flame. Her breath was the loudest sound in the world. Then, just as she leaned to add another log to the fire, it happened. A voice. Not words, not speech, a sound. The same melody she had sung for 30 years. Only now it was coming from somewhere deep within the trees. Slower, lower, drawn out like breath being pulled through lungs too large for a human body. There were no instruments, no birdsong, just that voice, just that lullaby. each line swaying through the dark like something ancient remembering how to be tender. Her body froze, but her eyes didn't close. She turned, slowly, toward the sound. It wasn't an echo. Echoes don't start before you do. She knew every cadence of that song. The slight drop in pitch on the word sunshine, the pause before away, whoever, whatever was singing it, it had heard her before. The song stopped instantly. And that silence, it wasn't empty. It was listening. She stepped forward, just one step, and the forest seemed to tighten. The shadows deepened, and then another sound broke through. A rustling, heavy, deliberate. Leaves shifted. A twig cracked under weight that was far too much for deer or fox. She didn't run. She just knelt where she was, hands on the earth, heart beating like thunder in her chest. And then the singing resumed, not closer, not louder, but heavier somehow, as if grief itself had grown a voice. Later in her journal, she'd write, "It wasn't just mimicking, it was remembering." She stayed there until the fire died to embers, and when she finally stood to leave, there was a new arrangement of stones behind her, not in a ring this time, but in the shape of a handprint, bigger than hers, but unmistakably human. She didn't sleep that night, but for the first time in decades, she wasn't afraid of the dark, because now she knew. She hadn't been singing into silence. She'd been teaching something how to sing back. Margaret didn't plan to return to the exact place where Lily vanished. She had avoided it for decades, not out of fear, but reverence. It felt like sacred ground, too heavy with memory to step on. But after the singing, after the handprint of stones, something in her shifted. Not curiosity, not even courage. A quiet permission, like whatever lived in those woods had left the door cracked open, just wide enough for her to step through. It was dusk when she went, the kind of fading light where everything turns blue and shadows stretch thin. She wore her thick coat, her boots that had molded to the shape of her bones, and carried nothing but a flashlight and a sense of knowing. The old trail had mostly disappeared. Moss blanketed everything. Trees had grown closer together, like time itself had tried to bury what happened there. But her feet remembered. They found every bend, every crooked root, like retracing a scar you thought had faded. Then she reached it. The clearing. It looked smaller than she remembered. Or maybe she had grown. Or maybe grief had made the space feel bigger back then, stretched it to fit all the terror she had poured into it. The boulder was still there. The one Lily had sat on that morning with a juice box and sticky fingers. But now, it was ringed in lichen and something else. Small feathers tucked neatly into the cracks, as if someone had been tending to it in silence. She stepped closer, heart hammering. The trees didn't move, but she felt watched. Not in the way that pricks your skin with fear, but in the way a stage feels just before the curtain lifts. She knelt by the stone, and that's when she saw the fire. Not flames, just a low glow, pulsing gently in the far side of the clearing, like embers cradled in a palm. She didn't hear twigs snap, didn't see movement, but she knew she wasn't alone. And then it came into view. Tall, massive, covered in dark hair that shimmered with frost, knees bent, shoulders hunched, sitting, not standing, cradling something in its hands. She couldn't breathe, not from fear, but because her heart, for one impossible moment, tried to recognize it. The thing it held was Lily's old handkerchief. Embroidered name, frayed edges, unmistakable. And beneath it, resting gently against its massive foot, was the teddy bear. Her teddy bear. The one that disappeared a year ago. Repaired with violet thread, and the creature didn't move. Only lifted its head, met her gaze, and in that moment, Margaret felt something she hadn't in 31 years. Recognition. Not of a face, but of a silence that had finally chosen to answer back. She didn't speak, not because she didn't want to, but because language felt too small for what stood before her. The creature, if she could still call it that, remained seated, legs folded beneath it like some weathered sentinel carved from the woods themselves. The firelight, soft and oddly contained, cast a copper sheen over its fur, revealing streaks of gray like bark touched by time. Its chest rose and fell slowly, as though breathing were a conscious effort, as though it had waited long to exhale, and it watched her, not with hunger, not with fear, but with something deeper, like it had been studying her for years, not from instinct, but from memory. She couldn't look away. Its eyes were dark, yes, but not dead. They shimmered with something old, something wounded, and something unbearably gentle. The same look she remembered from the mirror on the 5th night Lily went missing, when her face finally collapsed and she whispered, "Please come home." Then it moved, just slightly. It brought one enormous hand to its chest, slow and deliberate, as if mimicking something sacred, not aggression, not a warning. A gesture. She mirrored it, without knowing why. Her fingers trembled over her heart. The creature gave a slight nod, barely more than the tilt of a branch, and that was all. No words, no sound beyond the crackling of unseen embers. But between them, in the space where silence usually hangs, something passed. Recognition, not of names, but of ache. Then Margaret's knees buckled. She dropped to the forest floor, chest heaving, not from exhaustion, from something else, an unraveling. Years of solitude, of screaming into trees, of wondering if love could decay like bones. And now, here, something that wasn't supposed to exist, held the only pieces of her child that had survived. The scarf, the bear, both cradled with the kind of care you only show things you've come to love. She cried without noise. Her breath turned to steam, catching moonlight, and for one unbroken minute, neither of them moved. Then, as if the forest itself gave a gentle exhale, the creature placed the scarf gently on the stone beside her. Its fingers lingered just a second longer than needed. Then it stood, taller than any man she had ever seen, and stepped backward, vanishing into the mist like it had never been there at all. Only the warmth lingered, and the silence no longer felt like grief. It felt like something had finally heard her, and had stayed, long enough to remember. She stayed kneeling for what might have been minutes, might have been hours. The forest around her didn't resume its usual rhythms. No owl calls, no scuttling underbrush, just that same waiting stillness, like everything had witnessed something sacred and didn't dare interrupt. Her fingers brushed the edge of the stone where the scarf had been laid. The fabric still held warmth, not from fire, not from sunlight, from something living. Something that had understood what it meant to protect. She didn't chase after it. She knew, somehow, it hadn't gone far. But this wasn't a thing to follow. This was a presence to receive. As she sat back, the memories returned, not as visions, but as sensations. The countless times she had nearly slipped into ravines, pulled back by something she could never quite see, the distant grunts in the night that had stopped coyotes mid-prowl, the tree that had fallen away from her when the wind should have pushed it toward. She had chalked it up to chance, to mercy. Now she knew better. She wasn't alone in those woods, not since the beginning. The creature had been there, listening, guarding, learning. And most haunting of all, caring. She pressed her palm against the dirt, grounding herself. Then, with deliberate tenderness, she gathered the scarf, the bear, the bundled feathers she hadn't noticed until now resting beside the stone. A new offering. She didn't know what it meant, but it had been placed, not dropped. Curated, not scavenged. So she did the only thing that felt right. She sang. No melody this time. No full lullaby. Just a single note, carried gently, cracked and quiet, until it bled into the trees like smoke through fingers. And then, behind her, no movement, but a shift, the scent of wet fur. The weight of attention. Not close enough to see, but near enough to feel. She didn't turn around. Instead, she whispered, "Thank you." The wind moved then, not strong but specific. It curved around her shoulder like breath. It rustled the scarf as though lifting it in farewell. And the forest, for the first time in 3 decades, exhaled in unison. Back at her cabin, she wrote one line in her journal before her hands began to shake. "I was never walking alone. Not once. Something chose to walk with me." That night, she didn't lock her door. She left the window open. She left the window open. And she dreamt not of Lily's last day, but of a clearing lit by emberlight, and a silence that wrapped itself around her like an old friend finally ready to speak. But not with words, with presence. And that, she realized, was enough. By morning, the snow had returned. Light, like sifted ash, floating sideways through the trees. Margaret stood at her cabin door in wool socks, watching the flakes gather on the railing like secret letters only the forest could read. She hadn't spoken since the night before. Something in her chest had closed, but not in grief. In reverence, she returned to the clearing just before dusk. Not with offerings, not with questions, just herself. And still, the air felt different. Not charged, but acknowledged. The way an old friend glances up without needing words. The stone was empty. The scarf was gone. But the moss where the bear had sat was still warm. She stayed until dark, then walked back under stars that blinked between clouds. Her breath came slow, steady. Her bones didn't ache like they used to. She didn't write much that night. Just one sentence, scrawled at the bottom of a mostly blank page. Not all grief is meant to be cured. Some is meant to be shared. The next morning, the footprints were there. Not hers. Large, bare, deep. Following a curved path from the tree line to her porch, then stopping just feet from the threshold. There, in the center of the last footprint, lay a small braid of twine, feathers, and bark. A token. A signature. She brought it inside, placed it on the mantel above the cold hearth, and didn't question it. That night, she dreamt of a river, and of something enormous kneeling beside it, cupping water in both hands, not to drink, but to watch it reflect the moon. When she woke, the fire in her stove had already been lit. No wood missing from her pile. No ashes scattered, only a gentle warmth, curling through the cabin like a hush. She smiled without realizing. She didn't need to see it again. The creature. The one who had returned her lullaby. It had already answered her in full. She stood in the center of her small kitchen, still in her nightgown, eyes closed, and whispered, "I won't tell them. I never will." The trees outside stirred slightly, as if they had heard, as if they approved. Later, sitting at the window with a cup of tea she didn't drink, Margaret wrote her final full page. "I have no proof. No photo, no name. Only memory, and it is enough. It is more than most ever get." She folded the page neat, slid it between 2 others in the journal, and then closed the cover, for the last time. Not because the story was over, but because she knew she was no longer its only keeper. But when it did, it came hard. A deep, aching freeze that crusted the treetops and sent animals underground weeks earlier than usual. Margaret didn't mind. She welcomed the stillness. The hush of snow piling up like folded linens over every trail she used to walk. On the 32nd anniversary of Lily's disappearance, she rose before dawn. She moved slowly now, her legs stiff, her fingers slower to lace her boots. But she knew the path. Even buried beneath 2 feet of snow, her body remembered it. She carried nothing but a small, hand-carved wooden stake and a lily bulb she had been saving for months. She returned to the spot. Not the old campsite, not the stone, but a patch of ground beneath a gnarled cedar where the moss always seemed softer, where the air felt gentler. There she knelt. She pressed the stake into the earth, fingers shaking, breath fogging. Then she dug. Not far, not deep, just enough to place the bulb. She whispered, "Grow if you remember her," and covered it gently with her hands. Then she placed her palm over the spot and closed her eyes, and stayed. Hours passed. Snow fell again, and just as the first flake touched the back of her hand, something stirred. She opened her eyes. From the ground where she'd planted the bulb, impossibly, something green pushed upward. Not a full bloom, just a shoot, alive. Defiant, refusing to wait for spring. She didn't smile, didn't gasp. She just nodded and walked home. Weeks passed. Snow came and went, and when a local boy wandered through the woods one February afternoon, chasing his dog too far past the marked trails, he found something that made him freeze in place. A small mound of earth, smooth, undisturbed. At its center, a single white lily, fully opened. No tracks. No sign of tools, just the flower. And beside it, a circle of stones, the same shape that older folks in town now whispered about. The kind that sometimes appeared overnight along the ridge, always carefully arranged, always near trees that bent just slightly too far toward the earth. The boy ran home and told his mother. She didn't scold him. She just asked quietly, "Did it feel like someone was there?" He nodded. She didn't ask who. She didn't need to. Because by then, even the town had stopped pretending they didn't believe. They'd stopped saying Margaret White was crazy and started saying she was the only one who'd ever really listened. And the forest had answered. The following winter, Margaret didn't come into town, not even once. No flower from the general store, no post collected from the box she hadn't opened in months. No one thought much of it at first. She had grown quieter with each passing year, more a shadow of cedar and mist than someone you expected to wave from a porch. But when the snow finally broke in March, a hiker found her. She was lying beside the stone she had marked so long ago, bundled in her old coat, her gray hair braided and tucked against one cheek. Her eyes were closed, her boots were off, and in her arms, cradled like a child, was the teddy bear, the one stitched with violet thread. Its head rested just beneath her chin like it had always belonged there. No sign of pain, no struggle, just stillness, just peace. When the town heard, they expected no one to come. But they were wrong. The day of her burial, a slow procession of cars lined the road leading into the edge of the woods. Not just townsfolk, but old students, now grown with children of their own, former colleagues. Even the mayor came. Not for politics, for something older than office, for quiet apology. Someone had left a paper crane on every step up to the chapel. Someone else placed a bundle of feathers beside the casket. But it was the girl, no more than 10, who knelt beside the grave and whispered something no one else could hear. Her mother joined her, laid a wild flower down on the coffin lid, and said aloud, "I'm sorry I laughed. You were braver than the rest of us." The priest read nothing. Instead, one of Margaret's former students stepped forward and opened a folded piece of paper. It was a poem, her handwriting, old, faded, but still legible. The trees remember. The wind sings her name. And even silence carries a heartbeat. There wasn't a dry eye. And just before they lowered her into the ground, something happened. A breeze passed through, though no storm was near. It rustled the canopy gently. Then every bird within earshot fell still, and one man swore, absolutely swore. He saw a massive shape standing just beyond the tree line, tall, unmoving. One hand placed softly to its chest. No one argued. No one confirmed. And yet, no one ever forgot. Because from that year forward, on the anniversary of her death, fresh white lilies bloomed around her grave, even in frost. And sometimes, in the soft mud nearby, people found footprints, too wide for any boot, too deep for deer. And always alone. Spring crept in slowly that year, as if not wanting to disturb the hush Margaret had left behind. At the school where she once taught, someone placed a bundle of lilies at the foot of the old oak tree in the front yard. No one claimed it. No one needed to. A week later, the principal, an old student of hers, announced a small memorial reading during morning assembly. It wasn't official. It didn't need to be. One by one, former students stood in front of the class they now taught, or the jobs they now held, and recited fragments of poems Margaret had scribbled in the margins of lesson plans. She didn't teach from a book, one girl said. She taught from a place most people spend their whole lives trying to reach. A boy who had once mocked her came forward holding a note. It wasn't his. It was his daughter's. She had found it in the woods, wedged into a knothole in a cedar trunk. The paper was weathered. The handwriting faded. But it read, "If you ever find this, please don't laugh at me. I loved someone once, and I'm still waiting for them to come home." The room went still. No one laughed. The following week, a group of parents pooled money to commission a wooden bench in her name. They placed it just beyond the playground, beneath a small grove of firs, carved into its side. She listened when we didn't. A year passed, then another, and on each anniversary of her passing, someone, no one ever saw who, would leave a small offering on her grave, a feather bound with twine, a cluster of white lilies, even in the dead of frost. Once, a perfectly shaped heart of smooth river stones, tucked beneath the headstone. Kids from the school began making a quiet game of it, spotting the new token, leaving small notes of their own. One wrote, "I don't believe in monsters, but I believe in you." And each year, someone claimed they saw the figure again. Never close, never loud, but unmistakable. Tall, still, watching from the mist at the edge of the trees. An old woman once whispered to her grandson, "That's not a warning. That's a promise. Some things come back." Just to be sure we're all right, he asked her who it was. She didn't say. She just pressed her hand to her chest and looked toward the woods, as if listening, as if remembering, as if somewhere out there something still stood in silence to keep the song going. The headstone wasn't marble. Margaret would have hated that. It was a slab of local granite, rough around the edges, smoothed only where it mattered. Her name was etched plainly. No titles. Just a single line carved beneath the dates of her long, quiet life. She waited alone, so we could remember together. No one knew who'd chosen the words. They just appeared one morning after a storm, glinting wet in the morning light. The cemetery groundskeeper swore he hadn't seen anyone come or go. No new tire tracks, no footprints, just the engraving, perfectly done. But no one questioned it, because it was true. Every year after that, on the day she passed, the grave changed. Never vandalized, never messy, always precise. One time, it was a perfect ring of white lilies, their petals open despite the frozen soil. Another year, someone left a gnarled piece of driftwood carved into a spiral, polished smooth at the edges like it had been held. Thumbed, understood. But the bear came back most often. Not just the old one, but new ones too. Each sewn by hand, each with the same violet thread, and always left sitting upright at the base of her stone, sometimes facing outward, as if guarding, sometimes turned toward the woods, watching. By then, the town had stopped speculating. There were no more jokes at the bar, no more whispered warnings to children. Instead, her story passed from mouth to mouth like a winter tale told over soup. Gently, reverently, a little softer each time. And yet, The children kept finding them, the shapes, the footprints, not every year, not always clearly, but often enough to matter. Sometimes a teacher would find a drawing in a child's notebook of a large shape holding a smaller hand. When asked about it, the kids never looked scared, just curious. "Who is it?" they'd ask. And then the teacher, if they had been there long enough, would simply reply, "Someone who remembered how to listen." Even now, if you walk past her grave on a foggy day, you might feel it too. That pressure. That hush. As if someone just stepped back into the trees, as if they're giving you space. But not leaving, never fully leaving, because there are stories that fade. And then there are stories that stay, stitched into the moss, tucked between the roots, sung softly when no one is around. And somewhere, deeper in the forest, where no trail leads and no map ever marked, something old and vast still waits, not for rescue, not for fear, just to remember, and to remind us we were never really alone. In a world that often moves too fast to notice the quiet things, the hush between heartbeats, the breath of wind through pine, the songs we hum when no one is listening. Some stories arrive not to be proven, but to be felt. They don't demand belief. They ask for presence, for attention, for the soft part of ourselves we usually keep hidden beneath to-do lists, headlines, and noise. The story wasn't about monsters. It was about silence and what it means to be heard. It was about the kind of love that outlives the body, that lingers like a melody long after the room has gone still. It was about the wild things, inside us and around us, and how sometimes healing doesn't come in the form of answers or justice, but in being seen, in having someone or something acknowledge our ache and choose to stay. No proof, no fame, just quiet recognition. And maybe that's the hardest kind of miracle to accept. The one that happens not to fix you, but to walk beside you while you carry the weight. The one that reminds you, gently, without needing to speak, that what you lost mattered, and that your grief wasn't invisible. Because if there's one truth the wilderness teaches us, it's this: nothing ever truly disappears. Not the love we gave. Not the love we gave. Not the kindness we chose. Not the songs we sang into the dark when we thought no one was listening. They echo somewhere in someone. And if we're lucky, or maybe just open enough, well, we'll hear them return. Different, unfamiliar, but unmistakably ours. So maybe we don't need every mystery solved. Maybe the real magic lies in leaving a little room for wonder, for the impossible, for the things we cannot explain, but know to be true somewhere deeper than logic can reach. And maybe, just maybe, when the night is quiet and the trees are still, something ancient is listening to us too. Not watching, not hunting, just listening. The way we hope someone will, when we speak from the deepest part of our hurt. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If it stirred something in you, curiosity, comfort, even just a pause, we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or tell us your own story. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing. There are more stories waiting to be told, more songs to be heard in the quiet. Sometimes the things we most need to hear come not with proof, but with presence. And sometimes that's enough.